The Democratic National Committee releasing a really outrageous statement in response to Steve Bannon's ouster. It reads in part, and I quote, "There is one less white supremacist in the White House, but that doesn't change the man sitting behind the resolute desk." Well, joining me now to discuss Steve Bannon's ouster and a lot more, Washington Times opinion editor Charlie Hurt and Washington Times columnist Tammy Bruce, both are Fox News contributors. Tammy.
Hi, guys.
The Democrats have been crowing like I've never heard them crow before about Bannon's ouster. And not only was he a racist, but as I just reported, President Trump is a racist. Virtually anyone who supports Donald Trump right now is a racist. I hearken back to the 1950s, and I know you weren't around, but you're an astute historian. There was a moment when McCarthy went too far, when he essentially said that everybody's a communist. That's when people started to say, have you no shame, Mr. McCarthy? I'm just wondering if we've reached that point where people like Pelosi and the Democratic National Committee are saying everybody's a racist, and that's just too far. What do you think?
Yeah, it is. Look, the left's main problem very often is that they don't know when to stop. But we saw this last year. This is not a new attack, is it? And it really culminated, I think your point last year, was with Hillary saying that Donald Trump's voters are deplorables, right? Islamophobic and homophobic and sexist. That was a tipping point, which still exists to this point. So no one is surprised, and I'll give you an example as well. 2 days ago when the pile-on began, and this messaging that it wasn't just Trump, which is alone bad enough to accuse the president of something that is clearly not the case, but when then they started saying his supporters,
right,
and that these were his supporters, his poll numbers began to go up. And so now he's up in the Rasmussen poll today, 2 additional points.
He's actually up in the ratings
despite
in the past
all
week.
24/7 with these attacks. But I do think it's because when people see this and they hear this, Americans tend to generally be quiet if they're not on the far left or the extreme right, and that we do notice what's going on, we do reject it, and then they find out, of course, in elections. But I do think that the president should know that Americans reject this, the nature of this argument. And Americans who are being called racist by Pelosi and others in general, I think know then it reinforces to them that this is all pretty much a lie.
Charlie, beyond the shameless McCarthyism, which is what this is, and we've seen it before, we may have reached a tipping point, but there's also the absurdity. You now have Maxine Waters coming out and suggesting that Dr. Ben Carson, an African-American, is a white supremacist. I mean, come on. This has reached a point of absurdity, has it not?
Yeah, and that's why I don't really take any of it all that seriously, because I think the average voter looks at this and they just shake their heads and they think that they're now watching some kind of carnival unfold in the U.S. Capitol, and it's just absolutely insane. But Tammy is exactly right, and she hit the nail on the head when she talks about the fact that these people are not talking about Steve Bannon, they're not talking about Donald Trump, they're talking about the people that support them, and they're calling those people racists.
Yes.
And I can't think of anything more despicable or disgusting than looking into somebody else's heart and declaring that you know that they're a racist when there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest anything like that. And we're talking about a group of people, Nancy Pelosi, who has just discovered 15 years after she became Speaker of the House that they're Confederate statues in the Capitol, and she wants them all taken down.
Right. Suddenly she's surprised to find these Confederate.
To find out.
But Tammy, it's not just Democrats. You have Mitt Romney coming out with a long statement on his Facebook posting, essentially saying that everybody from the other side, besides the racists and the KKK, the people protesting, they were all peaceful. There was nothing wrong with them, when in fact the police chief of Charlottesville said they were mutual combatants. It was both sides.
It's a real shame with someone like Mitt Romney, who I grew to really appreciate and admire, to fall so far because of being defeated by someone who they just couldn't handle being defeated by. The fact is, this is why he lost, is a disconnection with the reality of what is going on the ground. And I just tweeted earlier, the people that are defending and cozying up with this Antifa group, without knowing all the details, are going to bemoan that, because that is going to backfire because of the level of violence that these people
and
use.
Charlie, it may also backfire because there is journalistic evidence to back up what the president was saying. And in fact, it doesn't come from the right-wing press. The Atlantic Monthly, not known as a right-wing rag by any stretch of the imagination, their cover story this month was the following: the rise of the violent left. Now, they pulled that as their cover story right after Charlottesville, I believe 3 days later.
Of course.
But this article and a lot of other articles, BBC had a piece, Antifa, left-wing militants on the rise. I mean, there's a lot of journalistic evidence that, in fact, what the president said is true.
Sure, and of course, the evidence, you can look at the video from Charlottesville and see that the president is right, and the president's talking to people directly and going around the left-wing media without and getting his message across that way. But you know, he's up against a party. And it's of course Republicans too, but in the Democrats, a party that has built an entire political establishment around that is based on color-coding voters, which
right.
Martin Luther King would say is the definition of racism. And they've built their entire party around that, and it's the only way they hold on to power. And I think that I really do think that if that's what Donald Trump is up against in re-election, he wins easily.